What if one of the most famous symbols in ancient history has been identified incorrectly, for decades? Millions of people know this object. You've probably seen it in documentaries, on social media, or in videos claiming it proves contact with an advanced civilization. Almost everyone calls it the Sumerian handbag. There's just one problem. It isn't Sumerian. That isn't a controversial opinion. It's the position held by virtually every Assyriologist who studies these monuments. Which raises a far more interesting question. If this symbol isn't Sumerian, where did it actually come from? And why did one of history's greatest empires carve it into palace walls over and over again? Before we uncover the evidence, subscribe to the Ninth Tablet if you enjoy documentaries grounded in archaeology, ancient texts, and real historical research, not speculation. Because tonight, we're following the evidence wherever it leads. The image feels familiar. A winged figure. A strange bucket. A cone held between two fingers. Once you've seen it, it's almost impossible to forget. Over the last decade, this carving has become one of the internet's favorite ancient mysteries. Some believe it's evidence of forgotten technology. Others think it's proof of contact with beings from another world. But before we ask what the object meant, we first have to ask whether we're even calling it by the right name. The Sumerians built some of humanity's earliest cities. Uruk, Eridu. They developed writing, monumental temples, and one of the world's first urban civilizations. Their history stretches back to around 2900 BCE. But the famous handbag doesn't come from Sumerian monuments. Not from Uruk. Not from Uruk. Not from Eridu. Instead, it appears more than 1,000 years later. Hundreds of kilometers farther north. Inside the palaces of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. That's why professional archaeologists almost never use the phrase Sumerian handbag. Museum catalogs don't. Academic papers don't. University lectures don't. The nickname became popular long after these monuments were discovered, largely because it was memorable, not because it was historically accurate. And yet, even after learning that, the mystery somehow becomes even deeper. Because if the object belongs to Assyria instead of Sumer, why did the Assyrians repeat this exact image across palace after palace? For centuries. That kind of repetition was never accidental. Every carved figure, every raised hand, every carefully placed symbol, was communicating something. But the bucket was never the center of the composition. It was always pointing towards something else. And to understand that, we have to walk into one of the greatest royal palaces the ancient world ever built. Imagine approaching this palace nearly 3,000 years ago. Its walls tower above you. Painted reliefs stretch for hundreds of meters. Every doorway is guarded. Every corridor tells a story. Nothing inside this building was placed there by chance. This was the northwest palace of Ashurnasirpal II, one of the greatest kings of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. Construction began around 879 BCE in the royal city of Nimrud. Unlike many mysteries from the ancient world, this isn't based on legend. It's documented history. The palace was excavated, mapped, and studied using modern archaeological methods. In 1845, British archaeologist Austen Henry Layard began uncovering the buried palace. Beneath centuries of earth lay room after room of astonishing stone reliefs. Scenes of kings. Military victories. Religious ceremonies. and strange winged figures unlike anything found in ordinary human life. More than a century later, archaeologist Max Mallowan returned to Nimrud, continuing excavations between 1949 and 1963. Each new discovery added another piece to the story. Not a story of aliens or lost technology, but of one of history's most sophisticated civilizations. Today, many of these reliefs are preserved in the British Museum. Others can be found in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York and the Louvre in Paris. Separated by continents, united by the same mystery. Look closely. The same curved bucket appears again. And again. And again. Different rooms. Different palaces. Different decades. Yet the gesture barely changes. That kind of consistency tells archaeologists something important. This wasn't decorative art. It was a visual language. A symbol everyone entering the palace was expected to recognize. The figures carrying these objects aren't kings. They're not servants. And they're not ordinary people. Modern scholars identify many of them as Apkallu, protective sages associated with Mesopotamian wisdom traditions. Others are winged protective genies. Whatever distinction existed between them, one detail remains remarkably consistent. The king never performs this gesture. Only these supernatural protectors do. Why? Because they aren't facing the viewer. They aren't even facing the king. They're facing something at the center of almost every composition. A symbol carved with extraordinary care. A symbol historians are still trying to understand. The sacred tree. And once that tree enters the picture, the mystery changes completely. At first glance, your eyes are drawn to the bucket. But the Assyrian artists wanted you to notice something else. The tree. It's almost always the center of the composition. The figures don't simply stand beside it. They face it. They reach toward it. They perform the same ritual gesture again and again. That much isn't a theory. It's carved into the stone. Across reliefs from Nimrud, Nineveh, and Khorsabad, the bucket and cone gesture is consistently directed toward either the sacred tree or toward the king himself. This pattern is one of the clearest observations in Assyrian art. Anyone can see it. The meaning, however, is another matter entirely. For more than a century, historians have debated what this tree actually represents. Not because the carvings are unclear, but because the Assyrians never left us a simple explanation. There is no inscription beside the tree saying, "This is what it means." Instead, scholars have had to reconstruct its significance by comparing reliefs, texts, and religious traditions. Art historian Irene Winter argued that these reliefs were never mere decoration. They formed a carefully planned visual program. Every figure, every symbol, every carved detail reinforced the king's authority and the divine order that legitimized his rule. In that interpretation, the sacred tree isn't just a tree. It's a symbol of cosmic order. The stability that the king was expected to preserve. Another influential interpretation came from Assyriologist Simo Parpala. He proposed that the tree represents something even larger. A symbolic map of the universe itself. A visual expression of divine wisdom, creation, and the structure of reality. It's one of the most discussed interpretations in modern Assyriology. But it's important to be precise. It is not a settled conclusion. Many scholars consider Parpala's work insightful, while others believe it reaches beyond what the available evidence can firmly support. Here's where the evidence ends and interpretation begins. Evidence. The figures perform the gesture toward the tree. The tree occupies the center of the composition. The same arrangement appears repeatedly across Neo-Assyrian palaces. Interpretation. Whether the tree represents life, royal authority, fertility, cosmic order, or something more complex, remains an open question. That's how real archaeology works. Not every mystery ends with certainty. Sometimes the strongest conclusion is simply admitting what we don't yet know. But the tree only tells us where the ritual is taking place. It doesn't explain what the figures are actually doing. For that, we have to leave the carved stone behind and turn to something even older. The written words of ancient Mesopotamia. Because buried in cuneiform texts are two Akkadian words that may bring us closer than ever to an answer. If the stone reliefs show us what happened, the written texts may tell us what it meant. Not directly, but close enough to change how historians understand these carvings. Two words appear again and again in Mesopotamian ritual literature. Banduddû, Mullilu. They don't sound familiar today. But together, they've become central to one of the strongest interpretations of the so-called Sumerian handbag. The word banduddû is generally translated as bucket or pail. A practical object. One designed to carry something. The second word, Mullilu, is usually translated as purifier. In ritual contexts, it refers to an object associated with acts of purification. Together, these two terms appear throughout Mesopotamian religious texts and lexical lists, forming part of a well-documented ritual vocabulary. Reference works by scholars such as Jeremy Black and Anthony Green connect these terms to the objects frequently depicted in Neo-Assyrian palace reliefs. This is where the evidence becomes especially interesting. But it's also where precision matters most. The words themselves are real. They appear in genuine Akkadian texts. Their translations are well established. What remains uncertain is whether the carved bucket and cone in the reliefs are explicitly the banduddû and Mullilu. No surviving relief includes a label identifying them by name. No inscription points to the object and says, "This is the banduddû." Instead, scholars reach that conclusion by comparing imagery, ritual texts, and archaeological context. It's a careful reconstruction. Not a direct statement from the ancient artists. If that interpretation is correct, the figures aren't carrying ordinary containers. They're performing a ritual of purification. Not for themselves, but for the space around them. The tree. The king. Perhaps even the palace itself. Small figurines are carefully placed before construction begins. The evidence doesn't stop there. Ancient ritual texts describe a protective ceremony known as bitmezeri. As part of these rites, small figurines of the Apkallu were buried beneath the foundations of important buildings. Not displayed. Buried. Hidden forever beneath the structure they were meant to protect. Archaeologists have recovered these figurines exactly where the texts describe them. Beneath palace floors. Inside foundation deposits. Still sealed beneath the buildings they were meant to guard. It's one of those rare moments in archaeology where written evidence and physical evidence reinforce one another. The texts describe the ritual. The excavations confirm that it happened. Now the picture begins to change. Below the palace. Hidden guardians. On the palace walls. The same guardians carved into stone. Different forms. The same protective purpose. And yet, One mystery refuses to disappear. What was inside the bucket? Water? Sacred oil? No surviving text answers that question with certainty. And because of that, the debate continues. Modern scholarship has narrowed the possibilities. But certainty remains just out of reach. So how do historians decide which explanation is most convincing? The answer lies not in a single discovery, but in how all the evidence fits together. By now, we've gathered several pieces of the puzzle. The reliefs, the ritual texts, the archaeological discoveries beneath palace floors. Individually, none of them tells the whole story. Together, they begin to reveal a pattern. But how confident can historians actually be? At the strongest end of the evidence sits one interpretation. Purification. The carved objects resemble ritual implements described in Akkadian texts. The figures carrying them are protective beings. And the gesture is performed in places closely associated with kingship, sacred space, and divine order. None of this proves exactly what happened during the ritual. But taken together, it's why many Assyriologists believe the bucket and cone formed part of a purification ceremony. One step below that is another widely accepted idea. That these rituals were also protective. Not simply symbolic, but intended to guard buildings, rulers, and sacred spaces from harmful forces. This interpretation is strengthened by the discovery of Apkallu figurines buried beneath palace foundations. Scholars such as Franz Wigerman have shown how these foundation deposits fit within a much broader Mesopotamian tradition of apotropaic, that is, protective, rituals. The reliefs above ground and the figurines below ground appear to be different expressions of the same religious worldview. Beyond that, the evidence becomes less certain. The sacred tree itself remains one of the most debated symbols in ancient Near Eastern art. Some scholars interpret it as a representation of divine order. Others see it as a symbol of fertility, kingship, or cosmic balance. And while Simo Parpla's cosmological interpretation has influenced decades of discussion, it remains exactly that. An interpretation. Not an established fact. Then there are the more speculative ideas. One suggestion is that the cone-shaped object resembles the male flower cluster used to hand-pollinate date palms. The comparison is visually striking. Ancient Mesopotamians certainly practiced artificial pollination. But no surviving text connects this agricultural technique directly to the palace reliefs. Without that connection, the idea remains possible, but unconfirmed. Other discoveries answer a different question altogether. Studies by Julian Reed of unfinished Assyrian sculptures reveal how these monumental reliefs were created. Artists first sketched the design onto the stone. Then rough-carved the figures. Only afterward were the final details added. It's remarkable evidence of Assyrian craftsmanship. But it explains how the reliefs were made. Not why the ritual mattered. And that's the remarkable thing about real archaeology. It rarely deals in absolute certainty. Instead, it weighs probabilities. It compares evidence. It accepts ambiguity when the evidence runs out. Sometimes, the most honest answer is also the most fascinating. We know far more than internet myths suggest. But we also know far less than we'd like. And whenever history leaves unanswered questions, someone is always ready to supply an answer. Whether the evidence supports it or not. That is exactly what happened to the so-called Sumerian handbag. And the story of how it became linked to aliens, advanced technology, and lost civilizations. may be just as fascinating as the artifact itself. If you've searched for this object online, you've probably noticed something. The archaeological explanation is rarely the one that goes viral. Instead, you'll find a very different story. One filled with advanced technology, forgotten civilizations, and visitors from beyond the earth. Over the past 2 decades, these ideas have spread through television documentaries, books, podcasts, and countless online videos. The most common claim is that the bucket wasn't a ritual object at all. It was technology. Some suggest it stored energy. Others believe it was used for genetic engineering. Some describe it as a device capable of opening portals, or preserving advanced knowledge from a lost civilization. They're fascinating ideas. And it's easy to understand why they've captured so much attention. After all, the object does look strangely familiar to modern eyes. But archaeology asks a different question. Not, what does it remind us of today? Instead, what did it mean to the people who created it? That distinction changes everything. When historians evaluate these theories, they look for 3 kinds of evidence: written evidence, material evidence, context. In the case of the so-called Sumerian handbag, none of the surviving cuneiform texts describe it as advanced technology. No inscription connects it to machines, energy, or devices beyond the religious world of ancient Mesopotamia. Archaeologists have also found no physical evidence suggesting the object functioned as technology. Instead, it consistently appears in ritual scenes, carried by protective figures, inside royal palaces and sacred spaces. And context matters. A symbol doesn't exist in isolation. Its meaning comes from where it appears, who carries it, and the beliefs of the civilization that created it. That's why most Assyriologists reject technological interpretations. Not because they're unwilling to consider unusual ideas, but because the available evidence points somewhere else. The extraordinary claim isn't the problem. The absence of supporting evidence is. Ironically, the historical explanation is hardly ordinary. An empire that buried protective figures beneath its foundations. That filled its palaces with supernatural guardians. That believed rituals could preserve order against unseen forces. None of that requires aliens to be remarkable. It's already one of the most sophisticated religious traditions of the ancient world. Strip away every modern theory, and one mystery still remains. Not whether the object came from another world, but why the Assyrians considered this ritual so important. That only their supernatural protectors were ever shown performing it. Because in the end, the greatest mystery was never the bucket itself. It was the civilization that carved it. And that's where our story ends. Or perhaps, where it truly begins. When we began this investigation, we asked a simple question. What is this object? But after following the evidence, that no longer feels like the right question. Today, we know far more than we did a century ago. We know these reliefs are Neo-Assyrian, not Sumerian. We know where many of them were discovered. Nimrud, Nineveh, Khorsabad. We know who excavated them. We know where they're preserved today. And we know the ritual vocabulary that ancient Mesopotamian texts associate with purification and protection. That's not speculation. It's the result of nearly 2 centuries of archaeological research. We also know something equally important. These figures aren't kings. They're not priests. They're supernatural protectors. Whether we call them Apkallu or winged genies, the message remains remarkably consistent. Across palace after palace. Across generations of Assyrian rulers. This ritual gesture belongs to them alone. Not once do we see the king carrying the bucket. Not once does he perform the gesture himself. That may be the most overlooked detail in the entire debate. Think about that for a moment. The most powerful man in one of history's greatest empires stands at the center of these reliefs. Yet when it comes to protecting the sacred order of the kingdom, the task is entrusted to beings beyond the human world. That wasn't an artistic accident. It was a deliberate choice. Repeated hundreds of times. Over centuries. Some mysteries survive because the evidence has been lost. Others survive because the evidence leaves room for more than one interpretation. The so-called Sumerian handbag belongs firmly in the second category. We may never know exactly what filled the bucket, or the precise words spoken during the ritual. But uncertainty isn't a weakness. It's what keeps archaeology alive. Every excavation, every new translation, every fragment of cuneiform, has the potential to change what we think we know. And that's what makes history so compelling. Not that every mystery has an answer, but that the search never truly ends. Perhaps the greatest mystery was never the object itself. It was why an empire that celebrated its kings chose to place one of its most sacred rituals entirely in the hands of beings that were never human. 3,000 years later, that question still waits for an answer. If you enjoyed this investigation, subscribe to the Ninth Tablet for more evidence-based documentaries exploring the ancient world. Leave a like if you want to see more deep dives into Mesopotamian history. And in the comments, tell us what you think. Why do you believe the Assyrians reserved this ritual for their supernatural guardians instead of their kings? I'd love to read your thoughts. History doesn't always reward us with certainty. Sometimes it leaves us with better questions. And perhaps that's the greatest discovery of all.